A real crime. In a series of podcasts, I want you to travel down some lonely roads with me. These are the roads I traveled with families who never got to say goodbye to loved ones. These family members were fated to live the rest of their lives waiting and wondering. I will begin this series with unsolved murders, but I will also revisit cases that include arrests because aspects of the case are worth re-examining. I wrote these stories when I worked as a reporter for the Charleston Gazette. Thanks for joining me today. I usually talk about human against human crime, but I want to talk about crimes against Mother Nature that can hurt us all. Episode 35, Chemical Crime. Let's begin with beauty before we plunge into ugliness. Arbuckle Creek is a federally protected stream that flows from Oak Hill, West Virginia, into the New River. Close to the river, the creek sprints into a waterfall. What spirit does not rise at the sight of a waterfall? The water in Arbuckle Creek dashes over huge rocks on its way to the river below. If you look at the falls while standing on the hiking trail below it, you see trees and wildflowers framing the falls. A pretty picture. You can turn and see the river nestled between the mountains. Way back in 1842, Captain William Thurman settled on Arbuckle Creek with his family. That was 21 years before West Virginia became a state in 1863. Thurman would go on to give his name to the town of Thurman on the opposite side of the river from Arbuckle Creek. In 1978, Congress created the New River Gorge National River, and 2 years ago, the National River was upgraded to a national park. By federal legislation, we are charged with the responsibility of keeping all water that flows into the protected river clean. When the water is clean, aquatic life can thrive. Birds, animals, and people can drink the life-giving water. But at its headwaters, Arbuckle can be dishearteningly ugly. Too many people who live along the creek throw trash in it and let their toilets run into it. Both acts are illegal. When the creek runs through Minden, a former mining community now part of Oak Hill, the creek picks up serious contamination. Here's where we have a real crime. But first, let me give some background. Starting in 1929, workers began to produce a class of chemicals referred to commonly as PCBs. Of course, everyone knows that is polychlorinated biphenyls. When they were first produced, PCBs were a godsend. They were an extremely stable set of organic chemicals that were used to insulate transformers and capacitors. They were fire resistant too. They were hailed in the beginning for helping with the transmission of electricity. Electric current heats up as it moves along a wire or a circuit. PCBs in insulators cooled down and absorbed the heat. People found many uses for PCBs, but in 1976, staff with the Environmental Protection Agency banned their production. By then, there were serious concerns about how PCBs could affect health in both short and long-term exposure. Scientists realized PCBs do not break down in the environment and actually tend to accumulate. For years, the owner of Schaefer's Equipment Company, the late William Schaefer, repaired electrical transformers on his property. The business was located in Minden, a place known to flood frequently. Flood waters moved the PCBs off-site and into Arbuckle Creek. Minden residents live in extreme poverty, and they've worried for years that they also live with higher than average rates of cancer. Many residents believe that exposure to PCBs make up part of the problem. Even to this day, in 2022, you can find signs in yards in Oak Hill that call for a full cleanup of toxins in Minden. In 1984, a State Department of Natural Resources inspector, Leroy Gilbert, found PCBs on the Schaefer Equipment property. Workers at Schaefer Equipment made and repaired power substations for underground mines. The Schaefer Equipment site was declared a Superfund cleanup site. In federal court, Lawyers brought suit against Schaefer Equipment Company and Berwyn Land Company. In 1970, Berwyn officials sold a 1.1 acre of land to Schaefer. Berwyn also owned some property that adjoined the Schaefer property. Besides the two companies, federal lawyers also sued a widow, Anna Schaefer. I always felt bad for her. She had to deal with matters all widows must face, but she, as a lone individual, was named in this suit. I can only imagine how overwhelmed she felt. Bob Karen arrived on the scene and tried to make cleanup history. He was the EPA's on-scene coordinator. Karen said he wanted to extract the PCBs from the soil and leave clean soil behind. When he surveyed the site, Karen said he found 77 transformers and capacitors leaking oil laden with PCBs. Found levels of PCBs as high as 260,000 parts per million. Examiners also found PCBs soaked into the soil as deep as 14 inches. Repeated flooding also caused PCBs to find their ways into the yards of Minden residents. People worried that they should not eat vegetables grown in their yards. At the Schaefer site, Karen told me he knew of a method that worked on a small scale in a lab to remove the toxins. He hoped he could scale up production, but no one had attempted it on such a large scale. In our conversations, Karen always seemed knowledgeable and interested in helping the environment. Karen and others also acknowledge that toxins are often removed from one poor neighborhood and trucked to another, so poor people on both ends are exposed to health problems. Karen hoped to patent the process and revolutionize how toxic cleanups were conducted. But his efforts to clean the soil on site failed, and in the end, the toxins were trucked to a tiny poor community in Alabama, the location for the largest hazardous waste landfill in the United States. This town had 53 residents in a recent census. Most residents are black. All of this cost a huge amount of money. The federal government handed a bill for more than $5 million to the landowners for the cleanup. Karen left Minden, but his career went on to give him world recognition. As part of the Persian Gulf War, the Iraqi military set more than 600 gas wells on fire. Karen was dispatched to the Middle East to help put out those fires. The first President Bush shook Karen's hand and awarded him EPA On-Scene Coordinator of the Year. But lawyers for the landowners stuck with the bill started asking questions. They tried to take a deposition with Karen. In a deposition, lawyers will ask a witness questions. The witness is under oath during the deposition and must promise to tell the truth. A deposition is usually taken before a trial. If there are differences between a witness's sworn deposition and the witness's sworn trial testimony, the witness could be accused of the crime of lying under oath. In both criminal and civil cases, lawyers will take depositions from witnesses before a trial as part of the discovery process. Both sides of a case want to know before a trial starts what they believe witnesses will say in court. They began to ask Karen questions about his educational background. They did not get straight answers. On his resume, and when he testified under oath in court, Karen said he had a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University and a master's degree from Drexel University. At that time, Karen lived in Mount Holly, New Jersey. Karen tried to say his mother had his undergraduate diploma and that he owed library funds and parking fees that prevented him from receiving his master's degree. He called that a paperwork problem, but it was more than just a paperwork problem. He did not have the college degrees he claimed he did. He had also sworn statements in court in other cases stating that he was an expert because of his college education. His sworn testimony even sent a man to jail. Karen's testimony convicted a man with a 7th grade education. Virgil Cummings was a self-employed contract hauler accused of violations that related to transporting hazardous waste. He lived in Harrison County, West Virginia, and made his living transporting the waste. With Karen's sworn testimony, Cummings was found guilty and went to jail. As lawyers looked more closely, they discovered that not only did Karen not have a degree from Drexel, but he had never even enrolled as a student. He did not have a bachelor's degree from Rutgers. When Karen went to work in Saudi Arabia to act as a special consultant while people cleaned up the oil-stained beaches during the Gulf War, he also lied to get his security clearance. In motions, one lawyer called Karen a documented perjurer. Karen led EPA cleanups in several places around the United States and testified under oath about his credentials. Without those credentials, he directed cleanups and did other work for the federal government. He even tried a giant experiment in Minden. But did he know what he was doing at all? In time, Karen admitted he lied and entered a guilty plea to one charge of giving false information. Federal prosecutors in the states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia wanted to prosecute him too, but they agreed to let him plead to the one charge. Soon after he came to Minden, Karen participated in public hearings with Minden residents. They worried about their children and pets who played in Arbuckle Creek. Were they exposed to the PCBs? Could Karen even answer their questions correctly? The landowners took their case to court to protest a bill they did not believe they owed. But for the residents of Minden, the so-called PCB cleanup left them frustrated and fearful. How could they find out what impact PCBs had on their health and their future? In the next episode, I want to talk about other federal employees who knew Karen lied. As always, thanks to you for listening. Thanks to Tommy Siner for his always great work, and to Brenda Purnell for her great technical skills. Please join me next Wednesday for another episode of A Real Crime with Susan Williams.